All right, today's video is going to be about very special quadrilaterals. We talked a little bit about them on the last video, but we're going to get more in detail today about all the characteristics of special quadrilaterals. So as a review, if a figure is a parallelogram, we talked about 4 in the last video, and we're going to talk about all 5 today. So first and foremost, and this is what defines a parallelogram, is that opposite sides are parallel. Hence why it's called parallelogram. Okay, we also know that opposite sides are congruent. We know that opposite angles are congruent. Let me redo that little congruent symbol, there we go. And we know that consecutive angles or adjacent angles, that means the same thing, are supplementary. And then the one we're going to add on today that we didn't talk about in the other video is that diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so let's go over to the diagram and let's mark all of this. So first and foremost, opposite sides are parallel. So let's draw in our little arrows. Opposite sides are parallel. We also know that opposite sides are congruent. Okay. We know that opposite angles are congruent. We know that consecutive angles are supplementary. So, for example, angles A plus angle B equal 180. And we could say angle B plus angle C equals 180. And we could keep going. We could say angle C plus angle D equals 180. And then we can also say angle A plus angle D equals 180. So basically, any 2 angles that are consecutive, so right next to each other. Okay? And then, like I said, the new one that we added on today was that diagonals bisect each other. So first and foremost, these are the diagonals. Remember, we go from one vertex to the opposite vertex, and they bisect each other. So that means that this is congruent and these 2 are congruent. Okay, so we need to know those 5 special properties. We need to have them memorized. So opposite sides parallel, opposite sides and angles congruent, consecutive angles supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. So start making flashcards or start quizzing yourself. So I went ahead and filled in the properties for you for if they repeat themselves. So a rectangle has all the same properties as a parallelogram. So opposite sides parallel, opposite sides congruent. Okay. Opposite angles are congruent, but I'm not going to mark that yet because there's something special about a rectangle. Consecutive angles are supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. Okay, but there's 2 special properties about a rectangle. First, all angles are right angles. So we're going to mark all of these, which would make sense that opposite angles are congruent and that consecutive angles are supplementary. And then another special trait is that the diagonals are actually congruent. So yes, they bisect each other, but they are also all congruent. So we would say that, diagonal FH is congruent to diagonal EG. So EG is congruent to FH. And then notice that I only used 1 tally mark for all these because all of these sections are congruent. Okay, so let's talk about a kite. A kite is not a parallelogram. It does not have opposite sides parallel. Okay, remember that's like the first thing that you know if something's a parallelogram or not. What it does have is 2 disjoint pairs of consecutive sides are congruent. So 2 pairs of consecutive sides are congruent. And let's go ahead and put a little disjoint in there. Basically, that means that it's not that all consecutive sides are congruent, just the ones that are disjointed. So if we mark this on our diagram, that means that KI is congruent to IT and KE is congruent to TE. Okay. The diagonals are perpendicular. So that is something special about a kite. Okay, remember, if there's one right angle, then that means that all of these have to be right angles. Okay, because vertical angle is congruent, linear pair equals 180, so all of these would have to be 90. Okay, one diagonal is the perpendicular bisect of the other. So one diagonal, perpendicular bisector of the other. So basically, all that means is that, again, the diagonals are perpendicular, and that means that one of these is also bisected, okay? And it's going to be the one that's kind of across that shorter distance. So let's go ahead and mark that these are congruent. So we would say DE is the perpendicular bisector of KT. So it's perpendicular to KT, and it bisects KT. Okay. And then the next property is one pair of opposite angles are bisected. So one pair of opposite angles are bisected. Okay, so that's going to be the longer one. So these are going to be bisected. Okay, and then also the cross diagonal, those angles are actually congruent to each other. So the cross diagonal angles congruent. Angles congruent. Okay. All right, we've got 4 more special quadrilaterals to talk about. So let's go to the next page. Again, a rhombus has all of the properties that a parallelogram does. So again, we have opposite sides parallel. We have opposite sides congruent. We have opposite angles are congruent. And we have diagonals bisect each other. Okay, and then after that, we have 2 extra special qualities. One is that all sides are congruent for a rhombus. So I'm actually going to go back now, after we've talked about that, and erase so that they all have the same. Okay, so all sides are congruent. And then the other special property is that that the diagonals bisect each other and they're also perpendicular. So let's add that onto here. And I'm going to go ahead and make that a little bit of a different color so we can see it. So these are perpendicular. That was not a very good box. There we go. And then lastly, diagonals bisect opposite angles. So diagonals bisect opposite angles. So what that basically means is that then we can, say that these 2 are congruent. They bisect opposite angles. Okay, let's talk about a square now. A square has everything the same, and we're going to add on that the diagonals are also perpendicular. So just like a rhombus, they are also perpendicular. Okay. And then hopefully we actually know some of these qualities about a square. Like, for example, all sides are congruent. That all angles are right angles. Diagonals bisect opposite angles. Okay. And then they also have diagonals congruent. So a lot of special qualities about a square. So diagonals are also congruent. meant to use the eraser. I was trying to make that look a little bit nicer, but that says diagonals. Okay, trapezoid. A trapezoid has bases parallel. So this would be the base is. And then upper base and lower base angles are supplementary. So upper and lower base angles are supplementary. So essentially what that means is that angle T plus angle R equals 180. So angle T plus angle R equals 180. So you need one upper and you need one lower. So angle P plus angle A equals 180. So one upper base, one lower base, and that is how you get them to be supplementary. Whew. Hopefully your brain is not exploding too much so far. Okay, next special quadrilateral is an isosceles trapezoid. So in an isosceles trapezoid, the legs are congruent. That's where the isosceles comes from, right? At least two sides are congruent. So legs are congruent. Bases are still parallel, just like a regular trapezoid. Okay. Lower base angles are congruent. So these are congruent. And then the upper base angles are congruent. So congruent, congruent. Diagonals are congruent. So congruent, congruent. And any lower base angle is supplementary to any upper base angle. So basically what we just did on the last one. So any lower base angle is supplementary to any upper base angle. The one difference about an isosceles, though, is that with a regular trapezoid, you only could do this being supplementary, only could do this being supplementary. With an isosceles, it can be either one. So I could do this, or I could go across. I could do this, or go across, due to the fact that these are congruent, and these are congruent. Okay, so lots of information, lots of properties that we need to learn. Again, I would start making flashcards, I would do a Quizlet. We're gonna do lots of practice, you know, making sure we know all the properties, but the sooner that you can get this memorized, the better. Okay, so this little shape right here means a parallelogram. So it says, in parallelogram CDEF, DE is 74, DG is 31, and FCD is 42 degrees. Again, mark your diagrams. So first it says find CF. Well, in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent. So if DE is 74, then CF is also 74. Okay. Then the next problem says find the measure of angle EFC. So EFC. Well, remember that in a parallelogram, consecutive angles are supplementary. So 180 minus 42 gives me 138 degrees. And then finally, it says find DF. Well, remember that in a parallelogram, that diagonals bisect each other. So DG is congruent to GF. So this is also 31. So if I want the full length of DF, I add the two together and I get 62 millimeters. Make sure that we use our units if it's given to us. Okay. All right, let's do the next one again also. So it's a parallelogram. So if it's a parallelogram, we know that opposite sides are congruent. So 6a plus 10 equals 8a minus 4. So I get 2a to equal 14, a equals 7. But that's not what the problem asked us. The problem asked us to find YZ. So in order to find YZ, I need to take 7 and plug it back in. And I get 52. And then the next example says find the measure of angle Z. Well, in a parallelogram, consecutive angles are supplementary, okay? Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles are supplementary. So these are consecutive since they're right next to each other. So I'm going to add them up to equal 180. So I get 27b to equal 189, so b equals 7. Again, I'm not done with the problem because it says find the measure of angle Z, which means I need to plug it back in. So 9 times 7 plus 2 gives me 65 degrees. So notice that we are just applying properties of quadrilaterals to our diagrams for arithmetic. Okay? All right, let's go to the next page. I will leave number 3 to do as a group, so let's do number 4 together. So this is an isosceles trapezoid. Okay, an isosceles, we know that because it's marked that these are congruent. So in an isosceles trapezoid, that means that the lower base angles or the upper base angles are congruent. So I'm going to set these two equal to each other. Notice that this is a quadratic, but there's no linear term. So I'm going to get 2x squared to equal 32. So I subtracted the 2x squared and added the 13. Divide by 2. So x squared equals 16. And then what do we have to remember with square roots? Plus or minus. And we do include the minus one on this one because if I plug it back in, it's going to square it and make it positive. Okay? All right. Hope you enjoyed watching the video. Again, we will do the last one. And again, I cannot stress, hopefully, Jim and Pablo, you guys are already on top of those flashcards, and Elizabeth, I know you'll definitely rock out flashcards, so I'm looking forward to hearing all the ways you guys are going to study. Thank you much.